Our story has a very simple beginning. These clouds have just delivered one of the most bountiful ingredients for the production of fine traditional beers to the countryside of East Hampshire. This is Windmill Hill, a famous landmark just a mile or two from the brewery of George Gale and Company. After the rain has fallen here, it percolates slowly through the ancient chalk downs to form secret aquifers hundreds of feet below. Once underground, it trickles obligingly towards the village of Horndean, where it reaches the domain of the brewery. Here, it ceases to be known simply as water, and instead, in the parlance of brewers, becomes known as liquor.
We draw our brewing water, or liquor as we call it, from our well, and the water in this area, being a chalk area, is quite hard. The type of hardness is what is known as temporary hardness. We have to remove that, and we do that by treating in our tanks. We also have to enrich the liquor with other salts, such as gypsum, and the process is known as Burtonization.
The liquor is pumped up from the well high up into the Victorian brewhouse. Here it waits in a large grey tank to be combined with crushed malted barley in the old mash tun on the floor below. In the grain store, malted barley with names like Pale Ale, Crystal and Black are mixed together with torrefied wheat in careful proportions according to the head brewer's chosen recipe. The grain hopper feeds the 1920s Porteous mill. It's a wonderful, clanking, whirring machine which transforms the barley and wheat into grist. Grist for the mill. In the past, the milling process would have relied on steam power, and on the ground floor, the original 1860s brewery steam engine can be found. It has been beautifully restored and brought back into steam. The grist is conveyed in its own private elevator to the top of the brewhouse, where it sits in anticipation in its bright blue grist case, just below the liquor tank. On the command of the brewer, gravity kicks in and the two ingredients are sent tumbling down pipes and tubes, mixing themselves together as they cascade in a hot, wet flush into the old mash tun. The liquor and grist will be gently stirred and infused into a steaming porridge-like mash to activate the enzymes that produce the sugars that are needed for fermentation. This process takes about an hour. After an hour or so, the mash is sparged. More liquor is sprayed onto the mixture to remove all the extract, or sweet wort, as the liquor is now called. Then the sweet wort is drained off and pumped into a bright, shiny stainless steel copper for boiling. It's at this stage that the hops, in pellet form, are added. Goldings, Fuggles and Challenger hops are used, all English grown and carefully chosen for their qualities of aroma and bitterness. The spent grain left behind is discharged into a waiting trailer to be fed to local farmers' cows. The empty mash tun can now be prepared for the start of the next brew. Before the modern copper was installed, the old 1920s copper in the brewhouse tower was used. It's still called into service for special occasions when it bubbles and steams away like a contraption out of a Jules Verne adventure. As part of their 150th anniversary, Gale's produced an especially strong brew to celebrate the turn of the new millennium, and this brew was boiled in the old copper.
Normally to other brews we use our modern copper, so this is quite unique seeing this one in operation. We only use it for small brews.
Once the wort has been boiled and is nicely hopped, a valve underneath the old copper is opened. The wort drains into a tank known as the underback. From here, it can be pumped into a large vessel known as a whirlpool separator. As the wort spins around, centrifugal forces drive the spent hops into the center of the vortex, where they can be removed and fed to those lucky cows. The wort is then drawn off and cooled through a modern paraflow heat exchanger, which cleverly recycles the heat back into the liquor being prepared for the next mash. The old cooler is still in place, but hasn't been used for quite some years. These heat exchangers, like huge automobile radiators, are part of the system. In the past, these louvres in the side of the building would have been opened to allow air to blow across the hot wort flowing into the shallow container, a fascinating reminder of techniques of times gone by.
Naturally, we retain our traditional process because we're producing a very traditional beer. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that we can compete in the marketplace, and that means that we must be as efficient as we can with our use of energy, and the way we brew must extract the maximum from our materials. So obviously we do use modern plant. And for example, if you look around the brewery, we might have a very old traditional mash tun, but we have a modern copper, a modern whirlpool, a modern paraflow for heat exchange. And again, then we've got our traditional fermenting vessels. So we do combine tradition with modernity. Main thing is to make sure that what we do produces an efficient product, efficiently produced product, cost effectively, but retains traditional character.
Part of that process involves careful monitoring of each stage of the brewing. Here, the alcohol content in Butzer bitter is being measured. The lower the sacchrometer floats, the stronger the beer. Yeast is the living, multiplying organism which converts the sugars into alcohol. And that job is carried out in these traditional wooden and iron-hooped fermenting vessels. Fermentation takes about 3 days, but for a special beer like the Millennium Brew, with an expected alcohol content of 10%, seen here being pumped into its fermenting vessel, the job will take just a little bit longer. Peering over the edge of a fermenting vessel is an unforgettable and unmissable experience. The aroma of hops and yeast is transported inexorably towards the nostrils on an invisible cloud of gently bubbling carbon dioxide. Once it's done its job, this yeasty eiderdown of animated foam and froth is skimmed off with a suction pump. It's fed along flapping pipes to be stored in yeast tanks for future use.
It's obviously important that we use our own strain of yeast. We use the culture plant to go back to a pure cell so that we can grow up pure yeast, which doesn't have any contamination or mutants. All the beers we brew here are English ale, top fermented, and therefore we use one type of yeast. And the yeast we use is a variety of yeast that we've had for many years. Any successful brewing company these days will have a quality control lab. The brewing process is a natural process. All sorts of things that can go wrong, and the laboratory has to make sure it doesn't go wrong. You have to make sure things like colour, bitterness, carbon dioxide content, alcohol content are all consistent with every batch that you produce.
Each brew is continually checked. Here, a sample is being taken from one of the holding tanks, where the beer is kept after primary fermentation. These holding tanks ensure that the supply of beer never runs out. Supplying beer to customers across Hampshire and beyond wouldn't be possible without casks. But before they can be filled, a little washing up has to be done. The sterilised casks are filled in the cellar. And at this stage, finings, the final ingredient, is automatically injected into the casks. Finings is a natural substance which will ensure the sparkling clarity of the beer when it's poured into the customer's glass.
The bulk of the beer we produce is cask conditioned, which some people call real ale. Other people, like myself, would prefer to call it cask conditioned, which means that the yeast is still in the beer when it goes out in the container to the pub, and it is still fermenting, very slow secondary fermentation. That gives you the condition to the beer.
Well now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th heavy horse parade here at Castlefield at Southsea. First turnout we see is the brewery dray from George Gale and Company, the brewers of Horndean. The horses around and driven by Mike Millington. He's a farmer from Salton, not too far from this ground.
This splendid horse-drawn dray is a fitting symbol of the traditional brewer's art. This one is typical of the drays used at the turn of the century to deliver beer from Gale's brewery to pubs like this one, the Red Lion at Chorlton, the oldest pub in Hampshire.
The final test has to be tasting it. And we taste each batch when it's racked in order to determine that it's suitable to go into the trade. It is purely quality control. And yes, I do try every single batch, and sometimes more than once. Ultimately, the principle is that the head brewer is responsible for the raw materials that come in, right through the process, right to the pub and into the glass. So if it's wrong in the glass, I'm responsible. If it's right in the glass, maybe I'm responsible.